So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here with us today. My name is Rudy Smithline. I'm a partner in Morrison and Foerster in the New York office, and I'm honored to be here with my esteemed panelists. I just want to take a second to introduce them. In the middle, we have Carolyn Herzog, the Chief Compliance Officer and Vice President Legal and Public Affairs at Symantec Corporation. She's based in Mountain View, California, and she's responsible for a number of things. I'm not going to pretend to name them all, but including legal enablement, global enterprise, the selling program, product, legal, privacy, and the Office of Ethics and Compliance. Prior to her current role, she was the head of legal and public affairs for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and was based in London for Symantec Corp. So thank you for being here. Thank you. Right next to me, we have Joe Azam, Senior Vice President and Group Chief Compliance Officer for News Corp Corporation, right here in New York. He oversees, again, a number of things, so let me know if I missed something important, but business conduct, internal investigations, compliance, which includes anti-corruption, sanctions, export control, and antitrust. And prior to coming to News Corp, he was Senior Vice President and Associate General Counsel responsible for anti-corruption program at HSBC, as well as served as a member of the Global Internal Investigations Group. And he's had similar positions at other companies, such as Accenture and Oracle. Welcome. Thanks. And lastly but not least, we have David Fontaine, who's Chief Executive Officer of Corporate Risk Holdings. And prior to his very current position, he's had a number of senior leadership roles, including Chief Legal Officer, Chief Risk Officer, and Chief Administrative Officer for several public and private companies, including TravelX Global Business Payments, American Management, and Proxycom. And before becoming a corporate executive and getting a number of chief roles, he was also a white-collar criminal defense partner at a litigation firm in D.C. So welcome.
Thank you.
And what we're here really to talk about today is, in the world of FCPA enforcement, 2015 may be remembered as the year that really just wasn't. If you look at the pure statistics of FCPA enforcement by the Department of Justice and the SEC in 2015, what we see is that the number of cases brought by DOJ and SEC, the size of the cases brought by DOJ and SEC, and the number of fines collected by these agencies greatly decreased from the prior years. Just to give you an idea, in 2014, DOJ and SEC collected over $1.5 billion in fines assessed. In 2015, that number got to about $142 million. And the question that keeps being asked is FCPA enforcement dead? Is that really where it's going? Was it just a trend that is now ending? And I don't want to focus today's discussion on whether that's actually the trend or not. But what I want to really do focus with these panelists today is, how does that affect the compliance program? For so long, compliance officers have been asking for and getting resources in order to establish compliance programs. But if FCPA enforcement is on a downtrend, will that make that conversation harder? Will it be more difficult to staff and properly resource compliance programs if what is expected, at least from these statistics, is that the FCPA enforcement is on a downtrend? And so maybe we can start with just, has the perceived slowdown of FCPA enforcement by DOJ in 2015, have you felt any pushback, or has that changed at all, the conversation you're having with your compliance program? And maybe we can start with you, Joe.
The short answer is no. And the reason for that is I think that both in my previous job and my current one, our legal department and our audit committee and our senior management understands that this is about sort of, the tides that come and go. And so 1 year of, I'd say, reduced enforcement activity or reduced fines is not going to convince people that this is over. If anything, I think it demonstrates the fact that there's some unpredictability here, and that you have to kind of like maintain some consistency in your approach and your investment, because if we have a sort of banner year next year, you can't all of a sudden respond and say, okay, well, we're gonna start paying attention again, and this has to be kind of a sustained commitment. So for us, it sort of hasn't really changed much of anything. Plus, you've had other developments like the Yates memo and the discussions around that have really shifted the conversation from the fines to, well, what else is happening and what other risks exist in the enforcement realm for anti-corruption.
And I want to come back to the issue of the Yates memo, because I think that's something that has raised a lot of questions in the last year. But to go back to the resource issue, Caroline, have you seen any difference or different conversations in terms of what is the return of investment that you're getting from your compliance program?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we all struggle with investment in resources. We're constantly getting pressure on budgets. All of us are building our compliance programs, and if you haven't had a major compliance issue, if nothing's wrong, you don't necessarily get that easy in to ask for budget. You mentioned that I have a variety of roles, so one of the things that I really leverage is pulling budget from others. So it's not just my budget that I rely on, but I rely on the budgets of others to get their resources to participate in compliance programs. And, we also leverage technology and we leverage budget year over year. And so you try to build on what you already have and sort of say, like, this is how we're using budget efficiently. This is how we benchmark against what others are doing to justify the budget that we have. And also, you look at the kinds of things that maybe have gone wrong or that you've gotten away with. We didn't get caught for this, but this is something that's a risk that we want to make sure we don't get in trouble for in the future. And you have to leverage that for what could happen and what you don't want to happen, or what's happened to others that, you want to make sure you don't get caught with.
And David, I guess, what sort of trends are you seeing in the work that you through the work of Cole and compliance risk? What sort of trends are you seeing?
I mean, I just want to comment on one thing that Joe said, because I do think that if you look at history, right, you can't just look at a timeline, if you will, and put a data point and say, okay, now it's okay. Everything's good now because we didn't have enforcement activity for the last 10 months that's manifesting itself today. Because I always used to say to people when I was in private practice, crisis gives rise to religion, right? Mm-hmm. In the face of crisis, suddenly everybody wants a compliance program. Suddenly everybody wants to do it right. And it's the sustained kind of low-level approach to this, the consistency to it, is where I think that people are moving. In terms of the evidence that we've seen, I was sharing with you earlier when we were prepping for the panel that, just the report that we've put out today that you're all going to be able to see is, somewhat, order of magnitude, 25% of compliance and legal executives across that were surveyed say, that they have no confidence in their company's ability to detect and identify the kind of anti-corruption risk that we're here to talk about today. So I think that there's still a recognition that it's necessary. I think your point about resourcing, though, is a real one every day, but it's not just about this issue. I agree with Carolyn completely that it's you've got to put a program in, and once you have it, you can't just turn it on and turn it off like a light switch when it's convenient, right? Because then you risk that gap, and you're going to regret it, and the cost benefit is just too high in the other direction, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add, we've taken this opportunity actually to talk about how it's not just the FCPA, right? Because really, it's not just the FCPA anymore, right? And you could list the Clean Company Act, you could list the UK Bribery Act, and the UK is a good example where they're kind of ramping up and taking their cue from what DOJ and the SEC have been doing for years, right? So just because there was a slower year here doesn't mean that you can't direct people to look at enforcement activity, DPAs, things that are kind of trending elsewhere if you are a multinational, and say, look, great that we don't have to worry as much this year about reading all these settlements, but look what's happening in London, right? Look what's happening in Brazil. Look what's happening in places like India in terms of enforcement. We still have to pay attention and figure out how we're going to comply with those laws, right? Because they all kind of plug into the same platform that you're using to do your FCPA work.
And I think that's a really valid point in the sense of whether enforcement trends are on the uptick or the downward trend here in the United States. I think at least as it relates to the fight against corruption, that is really something that has become a global effort.
Right.
And it's no longer, if you're a multinational company, to look at it through the lens of just the United States.
Right.
And I think that's absolutely true. And I think our companies are not necessarily looking at what we do and just looking at it from an anti-corruption lens. At the same time, I was in the UK when the UK Act came out, and we did so many panels and so many discussions around, the UK was very proud about the fact that they were going beyond just government, and it was going to be commercial enforcement as well, and then nothing happened. And we want to be very careful, talking to our companies about not being the little boy that cried wolf, and the sky is falling, everybody better watch out. And so I think it's very important to have a very holistic view. And so whether it's the SEC enforcing, whether it's DOJ, whether it's a variety of governments looking at what you are doing, there are lenses being put upon looking at what we are doing inside our companies, and you want to be talking to your companies not just about doing the right thing because the government is looking, and regardless of the branch of government that's looking at what you're doing, you want to be talking to your companies about doing the right thing. Doing well, doing good, acting with integrity. That, I think, was the theme that GE was talking about this morning. I think that's the right thing. And when you're talking about compliance overall, I don't know if you've had this question, but, I find myself stumbling a little bit sometimes when somebody says, compliance, what is that exactly? Is that compliance with all laws? Because I say, well, we don't do SOX. That's really the CFO's job, and it's not really compliance with all laws because we used to do trade compliance, but that's really somebody else right now because it does vary depending on how your organization is structured. And when we talk about ethics in particular, that's one target area. My team also covers privacy, but there is another group today that's talking about trade compliance. And when we report to the audit committee, we may be talking about other areas in the company that we have concerns about. We may be talking about risk, which is what the second panel today was talking about. So we report in a number of different areas. We're trying to get the whole company to think about risk in a broader sense and not just about whether or not this year was a particularly large enforcement year for one branch of government or another. We want the company to be thinking larger. We want them to rely on us to be a place of trust for the company, a place where people will come to us if they have a concern, whether it's harassment or whether or not it's somebody bribing a government official in another country.
And you raised the point of risk, of how does that play, though, into allocating resources, or how does that play into establishing your compliance program? How do you look at risk?
So coming from a bank, my view of risk changed, and the way I talk to the business about it changed. Because at a bank, you make money off risk. You make money off accepting risk. But having been in Silicon Valley before and being in media now, that's not the language that people generally use when they're trying to communicate compliance imperatives and why we should do certain things. But I found it to be a really effective tool, actually, because business people all understand risk, regardless of what they're selling. And so I found it to be a really powerful way to sort of encapsulate our general charge, right? Which is we are charged with managing risk in these 5 or 6 areas for the company. There are dollar or pounds associated with these risks. They cost something if you get them wrong, and they could affect your bottom line every quarter if you sort of trip up. And so I found just the term and the concept of a risk to be more important than just straight up compliance, because I think business people tend to listen more than if you just come in and say, well, this is a compliance issue, as opposed to this is a risk, guys. And the fine can be X. Your deal could get shut down. You might be barred, right? And then people start listening.
What trends are you seeing?
I was going to say, I think risk is the appropriate lens to look at this, because it's impossible to say that a specific compliance program only addresses one legal law set, to your point. There's positive spillover to, for example, vetting third parties that goes beyond anti-corruption risk. It goes to reputational risk. It goes to things that you necessarily can't quantify, just as you say, Joe, in dollars and cents, is that the reputation of your enterprise, if you're just doing business with somebody who somebody looks badly upon, they could be not engaged in bribery or any kind of necessarily corrupt activity, but if it's the wrong person for your brand or what your reputation you're trying to put out there, those kinds of things come out of these programs. And so I find it really hard really to put it into a box and say this is about anti-corruption and this is about bribery. This is about a cultural issue. We talked about culture, you've alluded to it, is what does your company want to be like? Do you want to be an integrity-driven company, and how do you best bring that into the culture? And it can't just be Joe or myself or Carolyn or anybody else sitting there saying, oh, this is the way the law, the law says we have to do. We have to make a business case for why this makes sense, right, for our enterprise.
And Caroline, if I can ask you to follow up with what David's saying of in the world of compliance, do you see a difference in terms of the business investment of compliance versus business integrity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to speak the language of your business partners. I think we all talk about that, but it is a very different language. I mean, I started off my first job out of college. I was a French and music major. I looked at things from a very different lens. I was very lucky. I got a job at the World Bank working in the Africa department. So I worked in international development for a while before I went to law school. And I always worked in the international environment. And then, as you know, I worked in Europe for a number of years, and I covered EMEA. And I spent the majority of my time in-house working in sales. And so, and then in technology, which is a very different environment than in banking. So as I moved more and more into the compliance field and into ethics, I know how to talk to salespeople in a very different way than you would if you just worked in the ethics world. And so when we talk about risk and we talk about compliance, it's about sort of understanding who your partners are, understanding who you're doing business with, and having a different kind of conversation. So if I know that if I just talk about compliance, I just talk about the program, they're not going to hear me. They're going to hear yeah, and they're not going to be invested in the program in and of itself. But if we talk about the integrity of their program, if we talk about risk and we talk about security, right? Because we're the world's greatest security company. Thank you for that plug-in. And we talk about trust and what it means if we have a problem, and how they're going to be able to talk to their customers about that. That's a very different conversation. Andrea and I visited LinkedIn's offices recently. Andrea's my colleague here sitting in the audience, and I know Amin was just speaking, and we were really excited leaving the office because I saw Anchorman on one of their posters, and I thought, well, that's what we need, because we're trying to speak in terms of values for our company, and we're a technology company, and we're trying to be a little bit trendier. And I know we're a little bit too boring right now for our technology company. We want our organization to listen to us. And so, I feel like I need Will Ferrell on a poster somewhere in my company so that, my salespeople are going to listen to me, which probably wouldn't work at a large bank, So, I need to connect somehow trendiness and Silicon Valley to the seriousness of a compliance program to be able to connect to integrity, which is not necessarily what you would do in New York in a big bank.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to hear what your reaction to that would be, given also the very different industries that you have worked through.
I think now more than before, I see an opportunity to link this stuff to your brand, right? Whether it's your consumers, your business partners, your distributors, they're diligencing you, right? If you can, is that a verb? I think we made it a verb today. So let's mark that as a development. But they're conducting due diligence on you as well, right? And so that actually is a good thing, because the better your brand is, the better your reputation is in the market, the easier that's going to be for people to work with you. And business people actually respond to that. So I see, at a media company now, that's a lot easier, because people really think about the brand. They think about the fonts on every page. They think about, what our questionnaires look like and how they're going to be interpreted. And you can really leverage that and say, you know what, that all matters. And this is a part of that broader enterprise of making sure that you micromanage every instance of someone thinking about your company, right? What does it mean to be one of the world's most ethical companies? What does it mean when people don't have to worry about you when they're doing business with you and your partners or your employees or your agents, right? So I see it as a big opportunity currently at this company, because it's what people are thinking about. Our salespeople are obsessed with the brand, right?
Yeah.
And so if you could link this to your brand in some way, not just externally but internally, I think a lot of that work gets done for you in terms of championing it and sort of making it a part of everyday conversation.
But I think it's got to go beyond a mechanical exercise, right? And it's got to be brought from the top. I mean, we talk about boards, we talk about CEOs, but if that message is not being actually espoused, it's one thing to send an email to your entire workforce and say, take the training kind of thing. But if they watch you and you're living it every day, I think that really reinforces what Joe and Carolyn have to do every day in their jobs, because if they're just left there showing up, telling everybody the rule set and not anybody giving it life, you're never going to get the kind of business level buy-in that you need. And, I also have to say that you have to live it, right? So if you find a problem and the leadership of the organization kind of sweeps it aside, it is a very corrosive event, I believe, in the culture of the organization, and it undermines all of this work. There could be 5 years of effort into your compliance program and how you approach things. And if you take an opportunity and people learn about it in your organization and somehow you've kind of looked the other way, conscious avoidance, whatever you want to call it, I think that's when the whole thing crumbles for you as an enterprise. And that's the real challenge, I think. That's why it has to be sustained, and people have to, in the leadership positions, have to do it. And you asked me, what have we learned? It seems that a lot of people are saying, the statistics that we've recently gotten from this group and others is that, more and more people are seeing C-level engagement on these kinds of issues. But interestingly, they define C-level to be the chief financial officer and the chief compliance officer, not the chief executive officer or the board, which I think is an interesting fact for all of us. Why does it seem to be stopping at a now, that may well be because that's the perception of the people that are responding to the survey, but they're living it every day. So you have to give some credence to the responses that, Kroll gets in the performance of the work that we do, that this is a problem and there's still a need to educate. And the only way you're going to get the buy-in, I think, is to get that leadership more engaged.
I think that's, so I was
Yeah.
just going to respond to that, because I think that's really critical, because we're connecting the values, which means you have to speak the language of the people that you're connecting to. And there's one piece, which is your salespeople, your average business people. There was a lot of discussion this morning about making sure there's no fear of retaliation. We're about to launch our employee survey, and we've been trying to figure out sort of what questions do we want to put in there. I think the suggestion this morning from the second panel around making sure you have that question about non-retaliation and using that as a benchmark every year is really critical. Using the fun piece about not being afraid of your compliance department and using business integrity and starting to talk about integrity over compliance so that people feel comfortable, maybe Anchorman, maybe not, maybe it's better for you, I don't know, but is really critical. Also, the name and shame and not being afraid to say when it's not acceptable. We have terminated people. We have done more name and shame and put it out there and made it very clear when it's not acceptable and said, we've had a public case where a former employee was sent to jail, and we've made that public, made sure that the employees knew. We don't want them to be afraid, but that at the same time, you do that balancing act of, making ourselves accessible, making sure people know that there's a culture of non-retaliation, but also making sure that when that line is drawn and when it's not acceptable. And that's a tough balance, I think, for that cultural fit of, how do you make yourselves both acceptable and also say, but we might send you to jail if you do something bad. So
But that brings up the question of, to go back to your initial statement, Joe, about the Yates memo, of what impact that may or may not have had on compliance program and how they get structured and what buy-in you get in that. And one thing I'd be curious is what you've seen, with the Yates memo and the focus on DOJ saying that they're going to prosecute culpable individuals. Have you seen that affect the program? Have you seen that change the conversation, maybe with the C-suite at the high levels, or does that have any impact?
Yeah, it does. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that we're no longer the only source of information on this stuff for our C-suite folks, right? They read the newspaper, they get contacted by firms that are pitching or friends they have. So they knew
Fear-mongering lawyers?
Fear-mongering, I didn't want to say, but yes, successful, effective law firm partners. But my point is, they knew it was coming and they wanted to talk about it. And the conversations we've had have been really easy because now they're really nervous. They want to understand what it means and how it changes things. And they're maybe a little bit more willing to say, okay, let's err on the side of caution here because, we don't want to hang our entire C-level out to dry if something goes wrong. On the flip side, I think we can talk about this more, is it has the potential to have a chilling effect on the investigations front, right, when you're sort of trying to talk to employees to get to the bottom of things. But I think it's, for us, a little too soon to know that. But the conversations with the executives have been really, I think, a lot better because it's an opportunity to talk about a risk that's always been there, right? This is not a new risk that individuals can be prosecuted. But the sort of, quote, increased focus has been an opportunity to have the conversation and say, hey, it's not as simple as, paying a little fine. There's, real stuff at stake, like your liberty. And then people tend to listen.
I was just going to add to that, too, that the other part of the Yates memo, obviously, is the notion that you must report if you're going to get cooperation credit as a company if you discover individual wrongdoing. And there's an argument that says that's always was the case, but they've really called it out now and put an underline underneath it and put it in bold. And so I think that's driving some of the recognition that you're seeing, Joe, that people are like, wow, now if I have to go through an internal investigation or outside counsel comes in, suddenly now I've got to be much more careful. I think you're going to see more and more people senior people saying, I got to get my own lawyer because now I'm uncomfortable. I think that's going to affect it. But in terms of an awareness, there's no doubt. But this goes through, cycles, right? We've talked about this. Right. There was the Thompson memo. Then there was the Holder memo. Now there's the Yates memo. And they all fundamentally say the same things. The Thompson memo was the most extreme because they wanted you to have to waive attorney-client privilege in order to get any cooperation credit, right? Mm-hmm. And that has sort of dissipated over time because then nobody wanted to talk to their lawyer in the process.
Nobody ever wants to talk to their lawyer.
Yeah. So I think that there's no question that I think it affects the mindset of people. But it's so moment in time driven, right? It got a lot of hype. And it's keeping the pace. It's the sustainability of this awareness that I think is the key challenge.
And add one more thing to what I said, which is at some level, what you really want to say is, this shouldn't change anything for you,
right?
Because this is about doing the right thing, and that's what it's always been about, right? So there have been times where I've had this conversation with colleagues in other companies, and we've said, this is all really interesting, but you kind of want to go back to your execs and say, you know what, like, you can forget that because we're just trying to do the right thing, right? So if you get caught doing the wrong thing, there are implications, and those have changed. Mm-hmm. But on day one, you just want to do the right thing, and that's how you want to communicate to your employees because people selling have no idea what the Yates memo is, and it's not their job, right? So you kind of want to focus on what is their job, which is to do business in the way that you want your company to do business, to protect your brand, and make sure that that you're maximizing opportunities for revenue, which is why they do what they do, right?
Mm-hmm. Which is actually one of the trends we've seen with a number of companies is I think there's a global understanding that if you're a multinational company, corruption is bad. Right? And so most companies now have compliance programs, and there's very strong benchmarks about what is expected, and you can check the box of what it is that you need. But what sometimes is missing is that element of the culture of how to apply that program, or to use your words, not giving it life.
Yes.
Of how do you have a program. And Caroline, I'd be curious to hear from you in the sense of you can have the program in place, but how do you get the buy-in or how do you get the investment from a cultural perspective to make it a living, breathing part of your company?
I think one is understanding that there is no one culture for a company. So I've worked, I've worked at Symantec for 18 years. I came from a company that Symantec acquired. I was the general counsel of that company. I was based in DC. I was based in London, and I visited so many of our offices, and no one office has a culture. And now I'm at our headquarters in Mountain View. And for those of you that have been to Silicon Valley headquarters of companies, I call it La La Land. We have our farmers market on Thursdays. We have our volleyball court. We have our electric car plugins. Like, it's a happy place. And so it's and what we talk about, our CEO roams the hallways, and we get to say hi to him, and it's. The culture doesn't necessarily, what we feel at headquarters doesn't necessarily emit to the culture in the other offices. And, I've worked in offices that are primarily sales offices, like when I first started and when I was general counsel of the other company that was acquired, it was quarter end, and the tequila man came on Friday, the last day of the quarter, and we were doing deals until midnight, and then they got increasingly easier, and that was before Uber came, So it is a changing environment, and then of course I used to laugh at the emerging markets in Europe, and the EMEA team they would get to the end of quarter and the cheesy emails would start to come through. They'd be like, my brother, I have climbed mountains, but I have never worked with a team that has, done all the things that you've done for me to get this deal done. And we didn't feel in legal that necessarily they were helping us as much as they were helping each other to get those deals done. So I think culture is a very fluid thing in a company. There's no one culture, despite what your code of conduct might say or what the laminated poster might say on the wall. So you have to know your clients. You have to have relationships, and there has to be a bit of quid pro quo because they need to know that you've listened to them in order for them to want to listen to you. And so we always create these visuals around a life cycle, what does a compliance program look like? It doesn't look like the 3 people that are on my team that are a compliance program. It has to be all of those people that are bringing back what we're trying to accomplish to their organization and talking to us about what they're trying to do. One of the panelists this morning talked about the communication lines. Compliance is also about communication. People have to feel like there's an open line to ask questions, because they're not going to take the training once a year and then remember, they have to know enough to ask questions. They're not going to remember everything that was in that training program. When you talk about the investment piece, it has to be that entire company, or that people knowing enough to ask a question, not just remembering, like, I'm not allowed to do that, or was it $25, or was it $26, or is this really a government agency, or is it part of a government agency? And I think one of the areas we talked about most with investment that all of us are struggling with, or I assume, is knowing who we're doing business with, and how do you get investment for that? We finally decided this year, when I was in Europe, we started our third-party due diligence program, and we're a very complicated company. We do business with consumers, we do business with governments, large companies, and everything in between. And trying to get all of those organizations in the company to invest in trying to manage a third-party due diligence program or a risk management program was impossible. But I leveraged the audit committee. I had to keep reporting to the audit committee saying, we have a risk, we have a risk, we have a problem. And finally, after years of that and trying to get all these people to give me a little bit of money, sometimes you just have to say, like, this is a big enough risk for the company that I just have to ask for the money for myself to get the program started, and that's what we've done this year. So, when we talk about how to invest in the company, sometimes you borrow from everybody and that works, and sometimes you have to say enough is enough, and I just have to go to my audit committee and say, like, we have to get some money to get this started, and then make it a big enough deal. So I also think sometimes being a little persistent dog, biting on somebody's ankle, you really do have to have that passion and persistence to say that, sometimes you just have to ask for the money.
Joe, I'd be curious to hear your experience in the sense of trying to get the investment. I know one of the things you focus on is technology.
Yeah.
And how that works with setting up a program, but also having a program that lives.
Yeah, I think this has been sort of one of the greatest areas to learn lessons every year, is expectation setting, right? I mean, I think we were talking earlier about how there are a lot of great solutions out there, for example, that will help streamline stuff, reduce the number of people you need on your teams, make things faster, get your due diligence done quicker. All that requires money on the front end, right? Particularly if you're sort of at a smaller company and you're just starting out, or if you're at a big company and you've had a problem, you need to relaunch things. So one of the biggest conversations that I'm having with people internally is how do we go to the board or whoever we go to and say we need X $1 million or X $100,000, and so what I've been focusing on is trying to demonstrate through work that companies like Kroll do and others that actually have data to show that if you're making the investment on the front end and you're automating and you're kind of using data analytics, all these things that are available to us now that cost money to implement, year over year, you're going to find that your costs are going to decline. You're going to process things quicker. You're going to have better results. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, it's going to be less of a nuisance or a disruption to your business. And that's sort of every day, right? Every day I'm having that conversation about technology. And we, on my team, probably use that word more than any other word in talking to our clients, because we know that that's sort of what's going to save us. Mm-hmm. They're not always going to guarantee us headcount, but once you get good systems in place and they're running, you can be confident that they'll have at least one person there to kind of keep an eye on that, and that kind of gives me comfort.
David, have you seen that change of the conversation shifting from investment on the front end to the reactive investigation?
No, I do think there's more focus on the front end because people see the benefits that Joe just mentioned. I also think, you mentioned in my background, I mean, I've actually represented people that have been indicted. And that is a substantial wake-up call for them. And as the lawyer, you get to know these people, and most of them feel like, well, we had policies. We had a policy on this. Why am I here? Right? And how did this happen to me? And I think one of the things that I always tell people in this area in particular is defensibility. What is the program that you have? What's the written record that's left behind so that you don't have to just say, oh, I had a policy, and then you're relying on the possibility of human error or whatever. If you've got an automated, technology-driven system that's consistent, you've got an audit trail. We talked about audit trail earlier, and someone mentioned it. And I think that is absolutely critical to the defensibility and the reasonableness. Now, it also goes to your other question earlier about the difference in size, right? One does not expect, I don't think reasonably, the same kind of compliance program that a GE has or an HSBC may have to some, mid-tier company. Yet the law doesn't, on its face, differentiate, right? So you've got to make those choices. And, you're the outside lawyer. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you tell the company that's kind of resource constrained? But I definitely see the move to the front end because there is this recognition that third parties are becoming more and more prevalent. There's more and more globalization. And once you put those two things together and then lay over at your point earlier that it's not just a U.S. thing anymore, I think more and more people are saying we got to have a systemic approach to this that can survive an individual, particularly leaving, or so that you don't have all these gaps in the evidentiary chain.
And to answer your question, what we do tell clients is the biggest mistake a client can make is set up a compliance program that they can't live by.
Yeah.
Like that is the greatest pitfall, is to establish yourself and put certain requirements that are either not necessarily needed for your company or tailored to your risks.
Right.
And so, one of the challenges I think that companies are now facing is because there is a standard now, you look at the FCPA resource guide and you look at, there's a lot of literature, you look at the DPAs and NPAs that really lay out the outlines of a compliance program, but how that gets implemented on a day-to-day basis, that's what Joe and Carolyn, that's what you live every day. So I'd be curious, in that sense, is I can tell you what best practices are, but I'm not the one that needs to pick up the phone at 2 a.m. when someone's asking for pre-approval. So I'm curious, how do you allocate the limited resources you have to really address your risks?
I think Joe said it really well. I think you have to think systems, and I think technology companies are pretty good at that. When you can talk to people about systems thinking, and if you can get in front of this and you can ask people for help and say, okay, here's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. You're the operations lead. Let me go to the sales operations head and say, help me think through in a systems thinking way how to get to this end result. And right now we're having a lot of conversations with people where we're talking about really operational resources, but talking to them really in the sense of, can you help delegate this person to be a compliance resource? And it's sort of these quasi-resources that maybe they were operational resources, maybe they were sort of quasi-audit resources, and we're making them compliance resources. So they have a broader role, but they're being delegated. So we're having regular communication friends, right? So we're having conversations around public sector compliance. We're having conversations around FCPA compliance. We're having conversations around certain areas of compliance so that they're getting heightened awareness, and when they're going back to their businesses, they're saying, hey, but remember, we have to bring this back to the third-party due diligence program. We have to bring this back to our privacy compliance. So we're actually creating development programs in the company as well as bringing compliance into the culture and having them talk about that, and that saves us money. That also creates awareness so that people are a little bit more concerned because they're having conversations, and I think it's helping, and it's certainly creating a better environment for awareness building and dedication to the program, where people no longer are pushing back and saying, well, is this really necessary? Do I have to do this right now? Or the constant delay and procrastination. And again, the audit committee really helps. I put it in my audit report. I'm no longer nervous about the things that I think are really important. It goes into my audit committee report, and I talk to them about it.
Yeah, I think, on the technology point, again, the other thing it does is it creates the opportunity to talk to people in common sense terms that they understand. So you have a population of third parties that you do business with, but that's not a static population. And so it's not a once and done kind of thing. And I think that people get, when they just pick up the paper, to your point, Joe, they see about these situations where somebody looked at somebody, but then 5 years later, they're doing aberrational things, and there was some indication that they probably were going to do that kind of behavior, but it was not caught because there wasn't a systemic go back and look at people on kind of an ongoing basis or on a periodic basis. And that's where technology, I think, and we see this at Kroll, really is something that people embrace, because the notion of having to potentially look at your vendor base or your third-party agents all the time, every third year or fourth year, depending on the advice that you get. I think that that's a real tangible benefit to technology that would be very hard, because it's hard to scale that with resources internally.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I just championed technology. Now I'm going to kind of refute what I said a little bit, because I think at the end of the day, you still need people to run
course.
it and do the right thing. So in some way, in kind of the point of the panel is, how do you justify continuous investment? It always, for me, comes back to culture and identity. What is the do you have those conversations, whether it's because you're launching technology or because there's been some sort of misconduct? Are you having those conversations on an ongoing basis at all levels of your company, right? At the audit level, at the sales level, at the partner level. Because I've been at companies where the technology was great and people were not interpreting the data in a way that was helpful.
Or looking at it.
Or looking at it, right?
Yeah.
And why weren't they doing that? Well, because they had other motivators that were there, like comp, and there wasn't an independent sort of set of eyes looking at things. So no matter how good the solutions are, I think it always kind of boils down to, the person who's reviewing it, like, what is their sense of right and wrong? And what have you done, I guess, as a compliance officer or a legal department to instill in them what you consider to be, the skills to help them make the right decision, or raise their hand if they've made the wrong one, which I think is also important.
There's a human element in every aspect of this, because even when you have technology and you get like a risk-based look, someone's got to make the ultimate decision. Right. The machine does not make a decision for you.
Well,
right?
and
So go ahead.
I'm sorry, and that is what compliance is all about, right? It's
Right.
people, process, policy, and technology. And you have to look at the overall, you have to look at the size of the company, you have to look at the culture of the company, you have to look at at what point is the technology investment appropriate for where you're at. And there always has to be that human intervention, but I think you're absolutely correct, and Rudy, you said this as well, is that at some point the manual process doesn't work if all the investment is in that one individual and that one individual leaves, or it's a manual process, and you said this as well, David, where you're going to miss something if that person isn't looking at it or doesn't know to look at it. So you need the technology investment and understand when it's appropriate to put that in and get the red flags, but we had this problem at Symantec. We invested in the technology, we were getting the red flags, and then everybody ignored the reports and didn't do anything about it. So we didn't have a human being looking at the reports to say, well, how are we going to remediate against that? So you have to have that, you have to have all elements in place and the appropriate investment, and you have to justify that. And if we don't have benchmarking with organizations like Kroll and Ethosphere to be able to look at what other companies are doing and make that appropriate to size and risk, then we're not doing our jobs and we're not paying attention to what's happening in the market.
Yeah, and I was going to make sure that you added that last piece of and risk.
And risk.
Because I do think to right size, you need to right size to your risk.
Yeah.
But I do recognize that we are the panel between you and lunch. But if anyone has any questions or anything afterwards, you can all find us at the conference. So thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.